Hello, in this lecture we're going to talk about oligopoly and antitrust policy, chapter 15. We're going to start off with our quote from Victor Kiam, who is a business person and has a very business-like quote here, which is that, in business, the competition will bite you if you keep running. If you stand still, they will swallow you. So clearly the idea being there that we need to keep going and keep pushing forward in the realm of business because of competition. Chapter goals and objectives are to explain the distinguishing characteristics of an oligopoly, distinguish two models of oligopoly, describe two empirical methods of measuring market structure, explain what antitrust policy is, and give a brief history of it. So we were going to start off with the distinguishing characteristics of an oligopoly. So an oligopoly is a market structure in which there are only a few firms, and firms explicitly take other firms' likely response into account. So we've talked about in the past what would be under a perfectly competitive market, which is an ideal, it's a model, it doesn't generally happen, but we can be way more close to perfect competition in the case that we are price takers. And we've also seen the idea of a monopoly, which is on the other end of the spectrum. So if we had the spectrum here, we'd have a free market over here of pure competition or a perfect competition, and then one person in the market having a monopoly on this side. And an oligopoly is kind of somewhere over here. It's more on the monopoly side, meaning we have a lot of market power in that we don't have complete control of the market, but there's a few firms in the market, and therefore those few firms need to take into consideration what the other firms are going to do a lot more closely than if we were over here, way over here in terms of perfect competition. And that's the reason is that there's so many firms in a perfect competition that we're just basically doing whatever everybody else does. We don't have a lot of choice there, because we haven't been able to step out or differentiate ourselves in any way in that type of model. Over here, we are very concerned with what the competition is doing. We're going to try to figure out what they're doing and act accordingly. So it's made up of a small number of firms in the industry, so we're only going to have a few firms in the industry, and any decision a firm makes, it must take into account the expected reaction of other firms. So you can think of things like airlines, or you can think of some of the big computer companies like Microsoft and whatnot. Those are firms where there's few players. You can think of like the auto industry. If they make a move, they're going to have to take in consideration what the others are doing in that type of industry. Oligopoly firms are mutually interdependent, so their decisions are affecting the other people's decisions within the oligopoly. Oligopolies can be collusive or non-collusive. So we'll talk about that a bit more, but they could either get together or they can not get together in terms of making policies together to benefit the whole. So firms may engage in strategic decision-making where each firm takes explicit action of a rival's expected response to a decision it is making. So notice we have a lot more speculation in this type of model. When we have few competitors, we're always trying to see what the other person is doing. And you can see this, you can think of this in a small term. If you have like 4 gas stations on a very busy corner where you have a cross street and you got a gas station on every corner, they've basically monopolized that corner in gas. And note that they're going to be very concerned, of course, with what the other person is doing on the other side of the street in the gas station. Now they can go over there and try to negotiate with them, or they can compete without negotiation. And those are the options that they could have in that situation. But they're very dependent and concerned, of course, with what the person on the other side of the street is doing. So models of oligopoly behavior. There's no single model of oligopoly behavior, but we have some ideas about this. An oligopoly model can take 2 extremes. So we have a cartel model is when a combination of firms acts as if it were a single firm and a monopoly price is set. So one way we can do this, you can think of like OPEC as an idea of basically a cartel type model. Many illegal cartels or things like drug cartels and stuff like that, where the idea is that the people got together and negotiated. Why would they negotiate and get together? Because if they compete with each other, they're going to keep driving down prices. And remember, businesses don't like competition. Businesses want to win. So either the business wants to become a monopoly, or they have a tendency, they have an incentive to want to act like a monopoly, even if they're not. How can they act like a monopoly and set monopoly prices? Well, they can get together and make up what the monopoly prices would be through the small set of firms. On the other hand, we could have a contestable market model is a model of oligopolies where barriers to entry exist, not market structure, determine price and output decisions, and a competitive price is set. So if we think about an oligopoly, it's not just that the firms could get together and have a cartel. It's also the reason we have an oligopoly many times is because there's high barriers to entry in some types of business, such as like the auto industry. To get into the auto industry, you'd have to set up a high amount of capital to get into the industry, or highly regulated industries, things like the phone company or things like the airline business, and these are often highly regulated, which is another high barrier to entry. So therefore, they tend to be oligopoly type of structures. Unlike other type of business, many businesses don't have as many barriers to entry. So if we wanted to start a bookkeeping business, we could basically start a bookkeeping business with fairly little capital in comparison to that. We could basically, get everything set up and start going in a service type industry such as that. Of course, if we were making automobiles, it would take a lot more for the startup costs in order to enter that market. So the cartel model. A cartel is a combination of firms that acts as if it were a single firm. A cartel is a shared monopoly. So just like we said before, a cartel means that kind of like OPEC, where they're going to get together and instead of us competing on what we're going to charge for our oil, we all get together and we set the same price. We set the same price a bit lower than what we would set if we were all acting independently in order to get those monopoly profits. So if oligopolies can limit the entry of other firms, they can restrict profit to a level that maximizes profits for the cartel. So note that, of course, just like any business, but oligopolies having so much power over a certain segment are going to act on that by trying to increase the barriers to entry. So even though oil, of course, already has a barrier to entry, you have to have the resources, but obviously they're also going to try to not have other people enter the market because they want to protect their oligopoly. So you have this incentive for people to want to limit the people and businesses entering into the market to keep their oligopoly. Output quotas are assigned to individual members firms so that total output is consistent with joint profit maximization. So note that the individual firms aren't going to decide on their own how much to output, because they would probably output more if they were making the decision without consulting the oligopoly. However, if they are in an oligopoly, they're going to have to limit that. And that's part of the problems with the oligopoly, because each individual firm has an incentive to break the agreement. Each individual firm has an incentive to lower the price. If the gas stations on those four corners that all set the price at a given price, if one of them just put the price a penny less, they're going to make a lot more money. They have an incentive to do that, and the rest of them have to, have some kind of pressure in some way to stop that from happening. So each member must hold its production below what would be in its own interest were it not to collude with the others. So that's, of course, the problem with oligopolies. People have the members of the oligopoly, although they're better off as a whole acting as one in the oligopoly, they would be better off individually if they lowered the price and increased production. So note the two goals of the business oftentimes are to win. They want to be a monopoly, but they also want to set the highest profits and get the oligopoly prices. So of course, if they think they can keep the oligopoly and that's the best they can do, a business has incentive to do that. If they think they can take over the entire market and become a monopoly or get monopoly profits even for a short time, they have an incentive to do that at times too. So that's a concern all the time with oligopolies. Implicit price collusion. Now you might think of this collusion thing, it has a bad tone, of course, in the US, and that's because it's illegal in the US for oligopolies to explicitly get together and create a monopoly. And the government has a role, and there's a question of how much of the role should be in the government, because of course, on a policy standpoint, we want competition. We want more competition. Why? Because that helps the consumers and it drives down prices. It gives pressure on companies to perform better. If companies have monopolies, they don't have any incentive to perform better. They can set the prices higher. They can limit the amount that they produce, and that's not what we want. So a lot of ideas out there is that the government's role is to help stimulate competition. And one of the ideas is that if there is a small amount of competitors in a market, it's illegal for them to go sit down at the table and actually set the price and have an agreement on it, and basically sign the contract and say, we are setting monopoly prices and we are officially, colluding in that way. Now, of course, in other countries, that's not the rule. In other areas, that's a U.S. law. So, like OPEC isn't under the U.S. laws, and they could basically have different regulations in terms of what they can do to set prices. So, and of course, any illegal activity is not gonna adhere to the law. So, if we talk about drug cartels and things like that, they of course their agreements may not be binding in the first place because they're not legally binding in the first place. But in any case, implicit price collusion exists when multiple firms make the same pricing decisions even though they have not consulted. So this still kind of happens. Of course, if we say, hey, your prices look pretty consistent over this oligopoly area, and it's legal to basically say, hey, we came to the conclusion to set the price. We didn't come to a formal agreement. There's no contract on it, but we came to this price independently, and that would be still legal. So sometimes the largest or most dominant firms take the lead in setting prices and the others follow. So sometimes that's what's going to just naturally happen, is that every firm knows that within an oligopoly, if they're in an oligopoly, they are dependent on the other players. And it may be the case that the lead player sets the price, and the others, if they want to follow along, will tend to follow along, and thereby basically have an informal agreement to have an oligopoly and set prices in that way.